So, what are the religious issues that will shape the electorate ahead for the November elections? Are religious groups shifting allegiances? What will be the impact of religion on who wins and loses? And through the prism of religion, what does November pretend for Democrats, Tea Partiers, and Republicans? These are, I think, some of the questions that the panelists are going to be talking to you about this afternoon. I want to congratulate our university's Institute for Policy Research and Catholic Studies, our academic think tank at Catholic University, and its director, Stephen Schneck, for organizing this important event. I would very much like to thank Institute Fellows Matt Green from our Department of Politics, and Mark Rosell from the School of Public Policy at George Mason University, who learned everything he knows at Catholic University, for their insight and analysis. And I want to especially thank Robbie Jones of the Public Religion Research Institute and Greg Smith of the Pew Research Center's Forum on Religion and Public Life for their gracious willingness to share the most recent polling data with, from their organization's ongoing research. Speaking for the university, we're honored by their open-handed generosity. So thank you, panelists. And let me close by returning to a point I began with. Those who anticipated a lessening or even an end to the role of religion in public life have, as I said, been proven wrong by history. But I also wonder if these kind of anticipations ever fully appreciate what strength religion itself actually brings to our public life. In our own American history, founders as different from one another as John Adams and James Madison maintained that religion was the best source of the civic virtues that good government requires. Alexis de Tocqueville, that most astute of outside observers, argued similarly. Maybe there's a lot not only to notice, but to celebrate about the renewed importance of religion in American public life. Maybe it would be good to see religion not as a source of conflict, but as a reason for renewing the virtues of citizenship that we need so desperately in these times. So I look forward to hearing from the panel about these issues. Thank you all for showing up.
Thank you. Thank you, President Garvey. Thank you for your wonderful comments, setting the stage here, because I'm Mark Rosell, I'm the moderator, and I'm going to talk just for a moment about the importance of the religion factor in the elections, but more so, I'm leaving time for the main event, which is our speakers this afternoon, who are going to be presenting some original research findings, some data on the role of religion in the elections in this cycle. And as President Garvey was just saying, there is a temptation oftentimes to dismiss the importance of religion as a factor in campaigns and politics. We were talking before this session about the growing interest in religion among academics in the fields of political science and previously sociology, and how difficult it was for a long time to get political scientists to pay serious attention to the religion factor as an important consideration in electoral politics and in governance. I spent a lot of my time in my career trying to convince people that religion is an important variable in American politics. But there have been some election cycles where I felt like telling people it's not the only variable that matters in American politics. And that certainly was true of some of the more recent election cycles that we've been through. But on the surface, things look very different today. Intense fascination with the emergence of the Tea Party movement has somewhat diminished the discussion in the public sphere about the religion factor in what role that plays in the midterm elections. It appears also that the religious right has been overtaken by the Tea Party as the major force of conservative politics today. And also that the Democrats, who reached out so eagerly to the faith-based voters in 2006 and 2008 and had some significant success, according to many analyses, seem to have largely forgotten this constituency since attaining power. Again, that's the impression that exists out there right now. In the latest election cycles, there was a lot of analysis of the role of religion in the campaigns. In 2004, remember, it was the conservative values voters who were declared the kingmakers. But then in 2006 and 2008, there was increased interest in the role that religious progressives played in the Democratic Party's successes. So what has happened? As the speakers today will make clear, there is little evidence that the religion factor is diminished in this election cycle. Perhaps only the extent of coverage and analysis of the religion factor has declined, again in part due to the rise of the Tea Party, but also the economic crisis and the apparent lack of follow-through by the White House and many Democrats in outreach to faith-based voters. So I'll conclude by saying it would be a mistake to overlook the religion factor this year, as many seem to be doing. And today's panel is intended to highlight the key role that religion is playing as the midterm races heat up in these final few weeks of these races, that is. We have three formal presentations. The first, Professor Matthew Green, who is a scholar of congressional politics at the Catholic University of America, will provide the overview of the electoral landscape in which religion is a key player this year. Robert P. Jones of Public Religion Research will present his latest data on the religion and social issues landscape and how they are likely to influence this year's elections. And then Greg Smith, a senior researcher at the Pew Research Center's Forum on Religion and Public Life, will consider how the voting intentions, specifically of Catholics, have shifted over the course of the election year, as well as how they compare to 2 and 4 years ago. Each presentation, I hope this is okay, will be about 15 minutes, and at the end of the 3 presentations, we will allow a brief exchange among the panelists themselves, and then leave it open to the floor for the predominant amount of time for questions and answers. So our first presentation is Matthew Green.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you for having me on the panel. And I'm very delighted to be here. Let me just start up my PowerPoint slide here. Okay. I'm going to give a very quick overview of the election terrain, where things are right now. Some of this, or maybe much of this, will not be news to those of you who have been following the elections closely. I will say, first of all, that my talk is going to be only about 5 to 7 minutes, so it's going to be shorter than 15 minutes, because partly my purpose is to introduce the terrain and then to let those who have more detailed information about the role of religion discuss their findings and their results. So, first of all, very quickly, here's what's up for grabs, among other things. We have in the House 435 seats. In the Senate, we have 37 seats that are up for grabs, 37 gubernatorial races, and then also the state legislatures. There are 88 state legislative races, or state legislatures that have elections this year. If I were to sum up the terrain of these and other elections this year in 4 words, it would be bad time for Democrats, and that's true across the board. What I want to do very briefly is just talk about each of these 4 categories in reverse order that they are on this slide. Starting with state legislatures, this is the current balance of power. There are 27 states in which Democrats control both chambers of the state legislature, 14 in which Republicans do, and then the remainders are either split, or there's 1 or more tied chambers, or in the case of Nebraska, I believe it is nonpartisan. Now, it's hard to get analyses. Not many people look at state legislative races and give predictions, but there are a few who do. Here's one by Louis Jacobson of Governing Magazine, and as of his analysis, which I believe most recently was in September, he predicts that the Democrats will shrink their share of state legislative chambers or states in which they control both chambers of the legislature down to 19. Republicans, it will increase to 19. And there are another 9 that are toss-up. I've actually also seen other analyses that suggest this is a conservative estimate for how well Republicans will do. Carl Klarner of Indiana State University predicts, based on his models, that Democrats will actually only control 16, have control in 2 legislatures, or both legislatures in 16 states rather than 19. So Democrats are going to most likely lose control of the lose the majority of states that they have in terms of state legislatures. State governorships, here's the current balance of power. It's pretty even. 26 governors are Democrats, 23 are Republicans, and 1, Charlie Crist, is an independent. Here there have been all kinds of different analyses, and some folks like Charlie Cook simply put, a lot of races into toss-up, and so it's hard to, based on that, know exactly what's going to happen. But several folks who do these state-based or race-by-race analyses suggest that the Republicans will pick up between 6 and 8 governorships in this next election. That's what that little light red shade is if the Republicans increase their share to 32, and that's counting the independent as a Republican for these purposes. So this would be a pretty significant loss for the Democrats in terms of the number of governors that are Democrats. Now, moving on to Congress. Here's the current balance of power in the Senate. 57 Democrats, 41 Republicans, 2 independents who caucus with the Democrats. Here I've seen ranges of those who look at individual Senate races anywhere from Republicans winning 1 seat to winning 11. But the general consensus that I think is emerging among those who look at these individual Senate races is that the Republicans will win between 6 and 9 seats. So here the Democrats have one sort of, I guess, silver lining on the dark cloud, which is it's very unlikely they will lose control of the Senate. It could, however, be a 50-50 Senate, which I like to call the Lieberman-Collins Senate. So that would be very interesting if we have that situation. Finally, the House. I want to spend a little bit more time talking about the House because it gives me an opportunity to talk very briefly about different ways that you can try to predict what the outcome of an election will be. Here's the current balance of power. Democrats have 59% of the seats in the House. Now, there are 2 ways, general ways, that one can try to figure out what's going to happen in an election, and the House races are particularly amenable to one of these. The first are race-by-race predictions, which is what the previous slides that I have are based on, where someone looks at each individual race and makes a judgment call. Who's going to win, or is it too close to call? The other way you can do it, however, is with a statistical analysis or a regression model, where what you do is you have an equation where you're trying to predict the number of seats that a party will win in an election. And then you have some variables in which each one you think is going to influence the number of seats that a party wins. You throw in past elections in order to estimate the influence of some of these variables, and then you predict from what you estimate. That is probably the shortest, if not the clearest, attempt I've made to explain regression analysis, so I hope that was not too confusing. Needless to say, it's math. So let me show what looking at the predictions are for each of these 2 categories. Okay. Race-by-race predictions. I've put together 8 different analysts who have made judgment calls about House races and put them on this chart. The red line is the magic number 40, which Republicans need in order to win control of the House of Representatives. Each one is represented by a line. The bottom part is the number of seats that each of these analysts are fairly certain Republicans will win from the Democrats. The upper part of the line is if they win all those plus all of the races they call toss-up or too close to call. And then I also put a little dot in the middle, which is the 50% mark, if Republicans win half of the toss-up seats. First of all, as of yesterday, this wasn't the case even last week, all of these analysts now make it within the realm of possibility for Republicans to win control of the House. That's the first point. Second point is that all but 2, which is Charlie Cook and Real Clear Politics, require the Republicans to win more than half of the toss-up races. Now, a lot of analysts say that they expect that to happen. Stu Rothenberg says it's going to happen. Many people say it's going to happen. But the point, though, is that this can't just be coin flips. Right? Republicans have to do well across the board and win a disproportionate number of toss-up seats for them to win control of the House, according to these predictions. Now, the second approach is the statistical models, and I'm going to have a chart that looks the same way. And I'll just, by the way, mention that I kind of partly stole this from a website called The Monkey Cage, which I strongly encourage you all to look at if you haven't already. It's run by political scientists here in Washington, D.C., and they collect political science information and make it in a way that's easy to understand, and it's an outstanding website. So this is a chart that shows a number of different economists, political scientists, and others who have done these regression models to try to predict how many seats Republicans will win. You can see there's also a fairly large range here, ranging from 22 seats all the way at the other end to over 50 seats that Republicans will win. A couple things to note. they're more optimistic that Republicans can win control of the House. All but 2 of these models showed Republicans winning at least 218 seats in the House of Representatives. The other thing, though, which I don't show here, is what I'm showing up here, which is the error bars, right? The maximum or minimum that could be won. And for some of these models, it's even bigger than it is for those who do race-by-race predictions. So for instance, Nate Silver, who is the 3rd from the right, who's currently predicting that the Republicans will win about 48, 49 seats, I think 48.5 is his number, seats in the House, says that his confidence interval for this is between 17 seats and 78 seats. So it's a huge margin. Right? Part of that is just building in the safety, but that's also something to keep in mind with these models, is that they can't necessarily predict with absolute accuracy how well a party's going to do in a given election. Now, 2 things that are certainly important for most folks who are trying to predict elections, and certainly those who do these predictive models. 2 variables that people look at. Most of the models, or I should say a number, look at the economy, which makes sense. Economy's not doing well, people are unhappy with the party in power. So unsurprisingly, Republicans are going to do well. The other is just the fact that it's a midterm election. All of these models take that into consideration. Midterms are elections in which the presidential party almost always does badly and has historically done badly, loses seats in the House and the Senate. And that's true, by the way, in state legislative races too, not just in Congress. So on average, since 1901, the presidential party has lost 30 House seats and 6 Senate seats, or 3 Senate seats. I think it's safe to say that the Democrats will be very thankful if they hit that average and don't go above it. Some other factors, though, that these statistical models take into consideration, and none of them use all of them, but most of them use at least 1 or 2 of these kinds of variables. How well has the party done in the past? So if you've won a lot of seats, you're more likely to lose seats. What's the presidential approval rating? People like or dislike the president. Other polls can be used, the generic ballot poll or district level polls. Information about candidates. Are they an incumbent? What kind of money are they raising? Or district information. How many registered Democrats are there in a district? Or what's the income level of these? Why do I mention these? Because to be sure, these all make sense as a way of predicting elections in the aggregate. But they do have, I think, some weaknesses, or at least we could call them, say, blunt instruments for understanding voting. So for instance, if we're interested in what dictates an election outcome, and we look at party registration, well, the question is, sort of, what might influence party registration? Right? Why is someone a Democrat or a Republican? Or if people think the president is good or bad, what might influence that? Those are questions that these models, to be fair, can't really answer, but don't answer, and they're nonetheless important. And for that matter, they don't necessarily look at other important aggregate information, and also how that information or data that might influence voting, and how that might change over time. Which gets to, I think, 2 very important variables, as Mark Rozell mentioned, which is the role of religion and religious values. Right? How does religion, religious faith, or religious views influence how you perceive the incumbent party, and thus how you might vote? And that's what we're going to find out today.
Thank you.
Okay, our second speaker is Robbie Jones of Public Religion Research. Robbie?
There? Okay, great. Very delighted to be here today to talk about the findings from the 3rd Biennial American Values Survey conducted by our organization, Public Religion Research Institute. The findings that we're going to release today, many of them are new, so this is a new analysis and findings. There is a report that we released last week, mostly focusing on the Tea Party movement and its relationship to the Christian Conservative movement and other religious groups. It's available out on the sign-up table. There's also a new memo that has some new findings from this week containing other findings and new analysis that we've been working on since then. All of this is up on our website at publicreligion.org/research, so you can get all of it there, including the slides today. So there's a memo and a report. The slides, I don't have to print out the slides, but the slides you can download from our website that should be up actually now. So just a couple of words of thanks before jumping into the findings. I do want to say thank you to the Institute for Policy Research and Catholic Studies at the Catholic University of America for hosting this fantastic panel today. I'm really honored to be a part of it. Special word of gratitude to Stephen Schneck, Director of the Institute, for inviting me and for putting it together. And I also want to thank Public Religion Research's Research Director, Daniel Cox, who's been a principal researcher on the project. And finally, the survey would not be possible without the generous support of the Ford Foundation, with additional support from the Nathan Cummings Foundation. So thank you to those organizations for funding the survey. So just a bit about the survey. The American Values Survey is a large, nationally representative public opinion survey of American attitudes on religion, values, and politics. It's the third one. We began doing this in 2006 and have been doing it in each national election season as the election is getting underway. This year, the results are based on telephone interviews, including 600 cell phone interviews conducted among a national random sample of over 3,000 adults, age 18 and older, between September 1 and September 14. So the first couple of weeks of September was the field period. So last week, as I said, we released some initial findings focused on the Tea Party movement and its relationship to the Christian conservative movement or the religious right. And my remarks today are going to focus on new analysis and findings from the survey that highlight important divides and shifts that are important to note in terms of this and coming elections. I'm happy to kind of pivot back to some of the Tea Party stuff during the Q&A question if that's of interest to people, but I'll focus on findings beyond that. So in terms of what I'll focus on today, the vote for a generic ballot vote and influences, including candidate support, and how those influences play across different religious groups. An important shift on social issues that I'll mention, and that is a decoupling of two issues often mentioned in the same breath, abortion and same-sex marriage. And our survey is actually finding that these issues are actually drifting apart in terms of support, with support for abortion remaining fairly stable and support for same-sex marriage actually moving in a more supportive direction. Some generation gaps on a range of issues and underlying political values, and finally, some interest, something that will be of interest to folks here today, especially I think, are some divides between Latino and white non-Latino Catholics on a range of issues, and also underlying political values that I think are often missed in some of the public opinion data. So let me just jump in here and give you a little bit. I'll start off with just the electoral context, and it makes a good segue from where we've been here. This is what the vote looks like as of, it was a generic ballot. We asked among registered voters who, in America, who they would vote for in their, whether they would vote the Republican candidate, the Democratic candidate in their local election district. This is what the vote looks like. We have Republicans at 44%, Democrats actually slightly ahead at 47% in early September among registered voters. But you can see there's a big divide here among the religious landscape, with basically white Republicans doing much better among white Christian groups, and Democrats doing much better among ethnic minorities and the unaffiliated. Is kind of how the dividing line basically looks here. One note about the Latino Catholic numbers among registered voters. We have less than 100 cases here. I'm putting that here for reference, but those numbers should be taken with a grain of salt because the sample size for those numbers are fairly small. So I've asterisked those for registered voters wherever they're here. So how does this compare to Obama? So this is the same levels of support we saw on the other slide, but I wanted to put up next to them the numbers from the national exit poll so you can see. And basically the story here is that virtually every group is lagging behind the the support. So Democratic candidates as a whole are lagging behind support that Obama was able to garner among virtually every religious group in the country. This is more true, interestingly enough, for the unaffiliated and for white Catholics. You'll see the numbers, the divides there are, the lag there is fairly larger in white mainline as well. They're 8 points, 11 points for the unaffiliated. So a considerable lag here among, I'd say it's unlikely that Democratic candidates are going to make up that gap between now and the election cycle. But I'm always you never predict, right? But that's what the numbers look like. So a couple of issues we asked about, issues that would be important for candidate support numbers. This is among registered voters. We asked, would you be more or less likely to vote for a candidate who supports abortion rights? Or would it make no difference to you? And you can see here the country is fairly divided, with slightly more saying that they'd be less likely to support a candidate who supports abortion rights at 35%, 30% saying more likely, about another third saying it would make no difference. But again, you can see a real difference here when you look at it across different religious groups, how this plays. So among the unaffiliated, among white mainline Protestants, it's a net positive for a candidate who supports abortion rights. More would say they'd be more likely than less likely. The numbers are basically even among African American Protestants, but among white Catholics, Latino Catholics, and white evangelicals, it's really a net negative. Although I would note, again with the caveat that the cases are small here, the high number of Latino Catholics who say it would make no difference, right? And 56% say it would make no difference to their vote on this issue. So how does that compare to a couple of other questions? We asked also about other important issues that have been in the debates this year that you've seen a number of candidates either embracing or running from, the issues of healthcare reform and comprehensive immigration reform. A couple of surprises here, particularly on the issue of healthcare reform. Not a lot of candidates campaigning on that, but we find that that actually a majority of Americans say, a majority of registered voters say that 54% they'd be more likely to vote for a candidate who supported healthcare reform than not. And you can see these numbers are fairly strong across the board. They're a little weaker among white evangelicals, 40% there. It's the only place where it's not a clear net positive. But among white Catholics, among white mainliners, clearly more supportive than not. Immigration reform, the pattern looks similar, but maybe a little bit less. You see less support among the unaffiliated there, but still majority support among white Catholics. Again, 39% support among white evangelicals, much weaker. But among the other groups and among the general population, even there's still significantly more saying it would make them more likely than less likely to support immigration reform. And then I'll just drop in the abortion numbers that were from the other slide that you saw just for context here, so you can see how they stack up in terms of people saying they would be more likely to support a candidate who supported abortion rights. But I think one of the stories here is healthcare reform. That's, I think, surprisingly robust support among a large swath of Americans for the candidates who supported healthcare reform. Now, here's something else interesting. We've all heard of, this is all about the economy. We found some kind of odd patterns in people's perceptions of the economy. It took us a little while to wrestle these to the ground, and what we ended up seeing is that there actually was not a high correlation between people's own perceptions of their personal financial situation and how well they think the economy is doing. So if you put these numbers up, along the bottom here is people's personal views. So if they say my own personal financial situation is excellent or good, fair or poor, and the categories we're running across here are about the economy as a whole, that over the last 2 years the economy is doing better, about the same, or worse. And what you can see here is, you see some difference among Americans who say they're in excellent or good shape. 21% say the economy is doing better. But even among those who are fair shape or poor shape, the numbers aren't hugely different, right? I mean, especially when we start looking at the numbers who say the economy is about the same, right? So even those who say they're in excellent state, about half, in fair and poor, all about half say the economy is about the same over the last 2 years, and then about the same number say it's getting worse. So not a lot of strong correlation between people's perceptions of their own financial situation and how they perceive the economy to be doing over the last 2 years. But then we looked at this. We noticed that people's perceptions of how the economy has been doing over the last year is strongly correlated to their partisanship, right? So that Republicans are 73% of Republicans say the economy is doing worse than it was 2 years ago. Only 27% of Democrats say that, and about half of independents say that. So you can really see this pattern. Now what's curious about this pattern is that Republicans are actually more likely to report their own financial situation as better than Democrats are, right? So there's a little counterintuitive stuff going on here. But clearly people's perception of the economy tightly linked to their partisan views. So a couple of things to point out. I mentioned a kind of decoupling, that we're beginning to see, I think, a decoupling of two issues that we've already mentioned, like the values voters back in 2004, the so-called values voters issues, abortion and same-sex marriage, and it seemed like every article you read, those issues were mentioned in the same breath. And it's sort of opposition for one was kind of coincidental with opposition to another. We're beginning to see these issues drift apart and decouple. And that's a really interesting finding, one that's going to have implications for both, I think, Republicans, Democrats, liberals, and conservatives in terms of political strategy over this election cycle and others. And so when we look at changes on abortion, we had a question on the survey that actually asked people to estimate or to tell us how they thought their own views had changed, to self-report how their views had changed over the last 5 years, and that's what this data is. On the issue of abortion, we had 85% saying my views haven't changed at all, but among those who said that they had changed, we had equal numbers saying they had become more supportive of abortion rights or they had become more opposed to abortion rights. So even among the change was in sort of polarizing directions. On the issue of rights for gay and lesbians in the country, we had 73% saying that their views had not shifted at all. But among the bigger slice that had shifted, we see a much different pattern. It's 3 to 1 among those who had shifted, saying that their views had shifted in a more positive or more supportive direction for rights for gay and lesbian people than had shifted in a more negative direction. So that's a kind of interesting shift. The basic trend lines show roughly the same thing that we've seen in a number of polls, our polls as well. The numbers on abortion have remained, they move around a little bit, but they basically stay around a slight majority of the public leaning to say abortion should be legal in all or most cases, with fairly big division and almost an equal number saying it should be illegal in all or most cases. So kind of a stalemate. The numbers move a little bit, but it's basically a flat line. And among on gay and lesbian issues, we see a much different picture. On this survey, we had a 3-part question where we asked about support for same-sex marriage, civil unions, or no legal recognition. And this is data from our 2006, 2008, and 2010 survey here. And what we basically see is between 2006 and 2008, a little bit of movement, but not much. But between 2008 and 2010, this year, we see an 8-point uptick in support for same-sex marriage. And I think that number is fairly significant. It's a fairly big number over a fairly short period of time. It coincides with people's self-reported views and trends, really, that we've been able to track across a number of other issues as well. So this sort of, just kind of recap here, I think the decoupling of these two, not only on views around same-sex marriage, on views about adoption rights for gay and lesbian couples, but also on the role of government, how big a government we should have, with younger people much more likely than older people to embrace a broader role for government in their lives, and on equal opportunity, interestingly enough, with younger people much more likely to say that equal opportunity and everyone having an equal chance in life is much more important than older Americans are willing to say that. So, but this is hard to overstate, really. A 30-point difference in support for same-sex marriage, 52% majority among those 18 to 29 versus 22% among those 65 and older. If you want to take a look at this, how this looks across religious groups, again, we see some real divides across religious groups. I put up first some legal support, so either support for same-sex marriage or support for civil unions. And the picture here is really that a little more than 6 in 10 of most religious groups support either same-sex marriage or civil unions, with the exception of black Protestants and white evangelicals over there to the right. And when I put up the no legal recognition thing here, you can really see this pattern that the break is really between white mainline and African-American Protestants and white evangelicals. So here's the no legal recognition lines here that you can see. So it's really, in most every religious group and in the general public, it's a third or less who say there should be no legal recognition of a gay couple's relationship. The two real outstanding exceptions are majorities of African-American Protestants and white evangelicals saying there should be no legal recognition. And those are the only two major religious groups with those views. One other thing on this point too, so here's the initial support. This is the same number from the previous slide. But one of the things we've been observing in the debates around same-sex marriage is a real confusion over what is religious marriage and what is civil marriage, and those conversations, those lines often get blurred, and the way we do marriage in this country often blurs those lines. And so we asked a follow-up question just to kind of see what kind of conceptual confusion may be going on. We asked a straightforward follow-up question of those who initially said they only supported civil unions or no legal recognition. We said, look, if the law only provided for civil marriages like you get at City Hall for gay couples, I would support allowing them to have a civil marriage. So a kind of clarification that we're really talking about civil marriages and not religious marriages. Interestingly enough, that clarification resulted in a 22-point jump in those saying that they would support same-sex marriage. So support goes from 37% to 59%. With this clarification about the distinction between civil and religious marriage. So kind of interesting artifact of the way these debates are happening in the public. So a couple of other issues that have been really prominent of late, some with the Tea Party dynamic and in the election. Minimum wage. We had a question about increasing the minimum wage from $7.25 to $10 an hour, so a substantial increase in the minimum wage. There's overwhelming support in the country for this. This includes every major religious group, even sort of white mainline, white evangelical Christians who sometimes are more conservative on these economic issues. Overwhelming support. This support actually goes across all partisan groups. Even 51% of Republicans support raising the minimum wage. The outlier here is people who consider themselves part of the Tea Party movement. They're the sort of main demographic that doesn't support raising the minimum wage to $10 an hour. The support for immigration reform. This is another area we've been talking about where the religion factor has played and made a real difference, I think, in policy debates. Immigration reform is certainly one of those places where we've seen religious faith leaders being very prominent in the debates. We find in the survey a 58%, nearly 6 in 10, support for immigration reform that includes a path to citizenship for undocumented workers who are already here, versus 40% who oppose it. Again, this has pretty strong support across all religious groups, including white Catholics. You can see the Latino Catholic number here is sort of off the charts, not surprisingly, and with white evangelicals basically being evenly divided with a slight plurality opposing it at 50%. I'm going to close with just a couple of slides that will, I think, highlight one of the interesting things about Catholics in the American religious landscape, and that is the kind of different, and you've seen this through some of the slides, the different places and attitudes on issues between non-Latino white Catholics and Latino Catholics. And so these last few slides I'm just going to get at are kind of political values, which are not issues per se, but sort of things that underlie issues. The first one is, I've mentioned equal opportunity as one of the places where there's a big generation gap. That's also true between white Catholics and Latino Catholics here. So here are the total general population numbers. This question was an either-or question that asked people to say which of these statements do you agree with more. It's not really that big a problem, and some people have more of a chance in life than others. Or one of the biggest problems in this country is that not everyone is given an equal chance. In the country, 53% say, a majority say it's one of the biggest problems in this country is that not everyone has an equal chance, so a majority being highly concerned about equal opportunity. Among all Catholics, you see the number looks almost identical to the general population there, 54%. But when you look at the differences between white Catholics and Latino Catholics, you'll see that that number that looks like the general population hides some significant cross-currents that are really running through Catholic life. And so white Catholics are still slightly more likely to say it's a plurality that it's one of the biggest problems in this country, not everyone's given an equal chance, but almost as many say that it's not really that big a problem. Latino Catholics, on the other hand, overwhelmingly say that it's one of the biggest problems in the country, that not everyone has an equal chance. On the role of government, we see a similar pattern. In the country right now, we have 56% say that the government is bigger because it's involved in too many things that should be left to individuals. So that's kind of a small government kind of attitude. Or versus government is bigger today because the problems that we face have become bigger, is the other side of this question. So in the general population, 56% government is bigger because it's involved in too many things should be left to individuals. Among all Catholics, the numbers look almost identical to the general population. But when we break it out and we look at the differences between white Catholics and Latino Catholics, we see a significant difference here, right? So the white Catholics are even more likely to say, to have the kind of smaller government position. Latino Catholics evenly split on this question about the size and role of government. And then finally, as the last slide here, a question that we have on whether or not America is a Christian nation. or not. In the country, we have kind of a spread over 3 issue positions. A plurality, 42% saying America has always been and is currently a Christian nation, 37% saying America was a Christian nation in the past but is not now, and 17%, about 1 in 5, saying America has never been a Christian nation. Among all Catholics, you'll see that that all Catholics are actually more likely than the general public, significantly, to say that America has been and always is, has always been and is currently a Christian nation. A little bit less likely to hold the middle position, but much more likely to hold that one. If you look at white Catholics, you see that it's even more pronounced, right? It's almost 6 in 10. White Catholics who affirm that America has always been and is currently a Christian nation. And if you look at Latino Catholics, it's Latino Catholics here that look much more like the general population than white Catholics. So the higher numbers for on Catholics here are really driven almost entirely by white Catholics on here. So some of that's about so I want to kind of give you at least 3 things and kind of political values to kind of think about kind of the different political worldviews and things that white Catholics and Latino Catholics bring into public life that I think show up on some of the other issues that we've seen. So I'll wrap it there, and happy to again take questions about this or questions about the Tea Party stuff we can talk about in Q&A.
Great, thank you, Rob. Thank you, Robbie. Fascinating. Our next speaker is Greg Smith from the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life, and he will be talking specifically about Catholics and the elections. Greg?
All right, let's see. Well, good afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm very grateful for the chance to come and talk with all of you and share some of our findings, focusing specifically on sort of the state of the campaign, the electoral dynamics that we've seen over the course of this year and heading up into the election. Can everybody hear me okay? Like I said, I'd like to talk briefly today about the current state of the race, the electoral race, both overall and specifically with a focus on American Catholics. What are some of the underlying forces that are shaping voters' respective approaches to this year's elections? Who's ahead and who's behind? We've touched on some of this already, but I'll get into it in a little bit more detail. Which issues do voters say are most important to them? And which party do people trust more to be able to handle those issues? These are some of the questions that I'd like to explore with you today. Let's begin just with the current state of the campaign. This won't come as any surprise to most of you, I don't think, but our latest polling shows that the race for control of the House is very tight among registered voters. In late August and early September, the Pew Research Center for the People in the Press, some of my colleagues, conducted a poll which included this question. If the elections for the U.S. Congress were being held today, would you vote for the Republican Party's candidate or the Democratic Party's candidate for Congress in your district? It found 47% of registered voters saying that they intend to vote for the Democratic candidate in their district, or that they lean toward voting Democratic, compared with 44% who said they favor or lean toward the Republican candidate in their district. 9% of the registered voters that we spoke with are undecided or say that they intend to vote for some other candidate. I think these numbers have the added benefit, correct me if I'm wrong, Robbie, but I think they are identical to what you guys got, which is always good when data converge on these matters.
Roughly same fill period.
That's right, that's right. Now, I should say, though, before going too much further, that I should reiterate that these numbers, and indeed most of the rest of my presentation, are based on registered voters, and that's something that's very important to keep in mind. Because if we look instead at likely voters, those people who say they've given considerable thought to the election, those people who say they think about these things and follow these things closely, and those people who say they're absolutely certain to vote in November. If we look at likely voters, that's where we actually do see a significant edge for the GOP over the Democrats. But what we don't have is a long-term trend line in the voting preferences of likely voters. And the reason for that is that it's simply progressively more difficult to predict who's likely to vote and who's not the further away you are from an election. So it's really only about this point in the campaign cycle that we're even able to identify and talk about likely voters. So to talk about these trends today, I'm going to focus on registered voters, but just keep that distinction in mind. Now you see here that these numbers among registered voters have not changed too much compared with polling that we conducted in the spring and earlier in the summer. This has been a tight race all year long. These numbers also closely resemble what we were seeing in early September during the presidential campaign in 2008. At a similar point in that campaign, our polls were showing 46% support for Obama and 44% support for McCain among registered voters. However, these numbers right here do constitute a rather dramatic shift relative to the 2006 elections. At that time, in that year, at a similar point in the campaign, our surveys were showing Democrats with an 11-point lead over Republicans in the same kind of generic House ballot. So this is a real change compared with our last midterm election. If we look now specifically at American Catholics, we can see here that they closely resemble the public as a whole. 44% of Catholic registered voters currently favor the Democratic candidate in their district, while 45% express support for the Republican candidate. Here again, we see that the voting intentions of Catholics have been pretty steady over the course of this election year. And it's worth pointing out, too, that though Catholics' voting intentions right now closely resemble what we were seeing among Catholics in 2008, here again, what we're seeing among Catholics is a real departure from the last midterm cycle. In 2006, in the late summer and early fall, Democrats held an 18-point advantage over Republicans among Catholic registered voters. And of course, in 2006, Democrats went on to defeat Republicans by 11 percentage points on Election Day, 55 to 42 in the generic House ballot. So the prevailing dynamic this year really is quite different compared with the last midterm election. And that's true both for the electorate as a whole and specifically for Catholics. However, recent elections have also taught us that it can be a real misnomer to talk about or even to think about a single Catholic vote, quote unquote. Robbie touched on this a little bit. We know that white Catholics, for instance, have very different political views than Latino Catholics. And we know that religiously committed Catholics, those who say they attend church regularly, for instance, have a very different political profile compared with Catholics who are less religiously involved. And we see that again this year. A fully bilingual survey conducted in September by my colleagues at the Pew Hispanic Center shows that among Latino Catholic registered voters, Democrats hold a commanding 69% to 19% lead over Republicans. By contrast, white Catholics, who account for about 3/4 of all Catholic registered voters, currently favor the Republicans over the Democrats, just as they have all year long. Support for Republicans is most pronounced among white Catholics who say they attend church every week. This group currently favors Republicans over Democrats by a 16-point margin. White Catholics who attend church less often are more divided in their electoral preferences. 49% in our most recent poll told us they favor the Republican in their district, compared with 41% who favor the Democrats. This gap in Republican and Democratic support among less frequently attending white Catholics is not actually statistically significant. So the race is much tighter among less religiously committed white Catholics than white Catholics who attend church every week. We see a similar kind of gap between weekly attending white Catholics and their less frequently attending counterparts in terms of respondents' self-reports of their likelihood of voting. There's been a lot of talk in this campaign about the enthusiasm gap, the greater interest in and attention paid to the election on the part of Republicans compared with Democrats. We see something similar to that here. Among white Catholics who attend church at least once a week, a group that clearly favors the GOP, as we just saw, 82% tell us that they are absolutely certain they're going to vote in the upcoming election. We give them a 0 to 10 scale and say if 10 means you're absolutely certain you're going to vote, 82% of them tell us they're definitely voting. Among white Catholics who attend church less often, a group that is less solidly Republican, fewer people, 69%, say that they're absolutely certain to vote. So we see here that the electorate as a whole is pretty closely divided as we approach November 2nd, as are American Catholics if we consider them as a whole. However, white Catholics currently express more support for Republicans than Democrats, and this is most pronounced among white Catholics who attend religious services regularly. I should also point out that these patterns in voting intentions tend to reflect, or are at least consistent, with what we've been seeing over the past few years in terms of people's party identification. Party identification is, of course, one of the primary factors helping to explain American voting patterns, and partisanship tends to be pretty stable over time. Over the past 2 years, however, we've seen a decline in the number of people describing themselves as Democrats, or saying that they lean toward the Democratic Party, and a corresponding increase in the number of people identifying with or saying they lean toward the Republican Party. If we combine all of the surveys that we've conducted over the course of 2010, we find that 47% of our respondents currently identify with or lean toward the Democratic Party, down slightly but significantly from 51% in 2008. At the same time, the number of people identifying with or saying they lean toward the GOP has increased from 39% in 2008 to 44% in 2010. Democrats' 12-point advantage in party identification in 2008 has shrunk to a mere 3-point advantage in 2010. We see a very similar pattern if we look at Catholics as a whole. And just as an aside, I think you're probably beginning to see this just like I often do in these data. There's a common pattern here. When we look at the characteristics of American Catholics, just considered as a whole, they often tend to very closely resemble, if not exactly reflect, the entire population. You saw this in some of Robbie's numbers. I see it over and over again when I look at data. American Catholics, considered as a whole, look very much like the country as a whole. In our surveys conducted in 2008, 53% of Catholic registered voters expressed an affinity for the Democratic Party. That figure now stands at 49%. In 2008, 37% of Catholics said that they supported or leaned toward the Republican Party, a figure that's climbed to 43% in 2010. So a 16-point Democratic advantage in 2008 has now shrunk to 6 points in 2010 among Catholic registered voters. Among white Catholics, we've actually seen our party identification trend lines cross paths between 2008 and this year. In 2008, 49% of white Catholics described themselves as Democrats or said they leaned toward the Democratic Party, while 41% sided with the GOP. In 2010, those numbers are essentially reversed. 49% of white Catholic registered voters expressed support for the Republican Party, compared with 42% who favored the Democrats. These numbers suggest to me that the trends we're seeing in Catholics' voting intentions are broadly reflective of, or at least consistent with, underlying shifts in the partisanship of Catholics and indeed of the electorate as a whole. They are also very much in line with trends in presidential job approval. At the beginning of his administration, Obama's job approval stood at 63% during the honeymoon period, and those expressing approval outnumbered those expressing disapproval of Obama's performance in office by a 3-to-1 margin. By last year this time, Obama's approval rating had fallen significantly, but those who approved of his performance in office still outnumbered those who disapproved by about 20 points. In our most recent polling, the electorate is now roughly evenly divided between those who approve of Obama's job performance and those who disapprove. We see a very similar trend if we look at Catholic registered voters, 46% of whom currently approve of Obama's performance, compared with 48% who disapprove. Among white Catholic voters, Obama's approval rating stands at 41%, while 53% say they disapprove of the president's performance. These numbers are important, though the plurality of Catholics, 42%, tell us that Barack Obama really isn't much of a factor in their decision about how to vote this November. 29% of Catholics say that they think of their vote in the upcoming election mainly as a vote against Obama, and 26% say they think of their vote in the upcoming election as a vote for Obama. So these numbers really do matter, and I think that's part of why you see them incorporated in many of the models that we discussed earlier. Beyond views of the president, what other issues seem to be important to voters in this election cycle? We've touched on this a little bit. Well, perhaps not surprisingly, economic issues rank at the very top of most voters' agendas. Fully 9 in 10 registered voters tell us that the economy is very important in their thinking about the midterm elections. And nearly as many tell us that jobs will be a very important issue for them this year. 6 in 10 people or more also tell us that things like healthcare, terrorism, the federal budget deficit, taxes, the banking and financial system, and energy are very important considerations to them as they prepare to head to the polls. More than half of registered voters say that Afghanistan, immigration, and the environment are very important to them this election cycle. And 2 hot-button social issues come in at the very bottom of the political agenda. 43% of registered voters tell us that abortion is very important to them this time around, and fewer still, 31%, say that same-sex marriage is a very important concern of theirs. This is similar, I should point out, to what we saw in 2008, when concerns about abortion and same-sex marriage were far surpassed by concerns about other issues. The issue priorities of Catholic voters closely mirror, once again, the issue priorities of the electorate as a whole. The economy and jobs clearly get top billing this year, with priority also being given to healthcare, terrorism, and the banking and financial system, among other issues. Less than half of Catholic registered voters, 43%, say that abortion is very important to them as they look ahead to November. And even fewer, only 23%, say that same-sex marriage is a major concern for them in this election. The views of white Catholics closely mirror the views of Catholics as a whole. They look almost just like this slide. However, white Catholics who attend church services at least once a week do exhibit a slightly different pattern in terms of their issue priorities. For this group, as with the others that we've looked at, economic issues clearly garner the most attention and concern. But abortion also ranks as an important issue for white Catholics who attend Mass regularly. In fact, 6 in 10 in this group say that abortion is very important to them this year, putting abortion on par with issues like the environment, Afghanistan, and immigration. Notice, however, that even among the most religiously committed Catholics, same-sex marriage ranks very far down the agenda. Only 30% of regularly attending white Catholics say that same-sex marriage is very important to them as they look ahead to the midterm elections. In short, same-sex marriage really is not shaping up to be a key issue this election cycle. As I begin to wrap up here, I'd like to try to bring matters full circle. You know, we saw at the beginning of the presentation that the electorate as a whole is evenly divided between those who plan to vote Democratic in November and those who lean toward the GOP. And the same thing is true of American Catholics, though white Catholics appear likely to throw their support behind the GOP. We've also seen that voters tell us that economic issues are at the very top of their list of concerns. Our data show that some of the dynamics of the electoral horse race mirror views of which party is better equipped to handle economic issues. A September poll by the Pew Research Center for the People in the Press asked this question: please tell me if you think the Republican Party or the Democratic Party could do a better job of improving the job situation. As with electoral preferences, the public as a whole is closely divided on this question, with 41% saying the Democrats can do a better job in this area, and 42% saying Republicans can do a better job. But among white Catholics, Fully 50% say that the Republicans can better deal with the jobs issue, compared with only 35% who think Democrats would better handle the job situation. So, in wrapping up, I do hope that this provides a bit of a baseline for understanding the dynamics that underlay the current election cycle. The electorate as a whole is closely divided. This is a very different situation than we saw in the previous midterm election of 2006, when Democrats held a clear advantage over Republicans at this point in the campaign cycle. But this state of affairs reflects changes that we've seen over the past couple of years in the partisanship of many voters, as well as the decline we've observed in Barack Obama's approval ratings. The current voting intentions of Catholics closely resemble those of the public as a whole, but white Catholics, especially those who attend religious services weekly, currently express more support for Republicans than Democrats in the upcoming election. Voters in 2010, including Catholic voters, are most concerned about economic issues, with social issues like abortion and gay marriage ranking far down on the agenda for most people. Weekly attending white Catholics are an exception. Most of them say abortion is very important to them, though even among this group, economic concerns seem to trump concerns about social issues. Now, of course, we still have several weeks to go before the elections, and we'll just have to see how things play out. But as I mentioned, I do hope these data serve as a useful baseline. I thank you for your attention and look forward to taking your questions and our discussion.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you to all on the panel. We're running just a little bit long, so I'm going to leave the predominant time now for questions and answers. So when you ask your question, please identify yourself and speak into the microphone, which I think is going to be passed around by Steve Schneck. And I just wanted to take the moderator's prerogative to ask the first question to warm things up here, because we've had two presentations offering election data based on surveys that were done in early September. Here we are in October. Some of the findings I found a little bit counterintuitive, such as on how healthcare is playing as an issue or immigration and the like. Are you aware of data in the past month or so that would suggest some different trending that's going on? Or do you consider the findings from early September to be consistent with what people are looking at presently based on other surveys that have been conducted out in the field? And I can allow that question for either Robbie or Greg.
Sure, and maybe Greg has some. I'm not aware of any right off the top of my head that has asked specifically about it more recently, but I don't know if Greg has anything queued up or not on that.
Not really queued up. I can't say that I agree with you. Robbie and I were talking before we got started. Our data most of the data that I discussed, the most recent data, is from polling that was conducted in late August and early September. It's the most recent data that we have. We haven't done another survey since then, so it would be great to be able to. It would be great if we had updated numbers. We just don't. I can't say, and I don't know how this will compare. But my colleagues at the Pew Research Center for the People in the Press did do a survey last week, I guess. I'm looking at a report here from October 6th, which is available on our website. They didn't ask a voting intention question, but they did ask a series of questions about whether or not different candidate characteristics would make people more likely or less likely to vote to vote for someone. One of the questions they asked is, what if the candidate in your district supported the health care law passed this year? And they found 35% saying that that would make them less likely to vote for that candidate, 36% more likely, and then 25% saying that it wouldn't make any difference. So I don't know how that compared with what you got a few weeks before that, or
Right, so we've got 54% saying more likely
Okay.
on that question. So we've got significantly higher numbers on that. So there's a couple of
Hard to know-
explanations.
hard to know.
The questions aren't
Yeah.
worded exactly
I don't
the
know.
same
Right,
way,
right.
and we've got a different time period, so
Yeah.
it's hard to know,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, but that's interesting.
Yeah.
So it's tough to say if it's a trend then, but something we're looking at.
Right.
Okay, thank you very much. Steve, do you want to call the questions? Okay, thank you.
Hi, I'm Penny Starr with CNS News, and that was a perfect introduction to my question, because I wanted to ask about methodology, because when you ask people, do you support a candidate who is for health reform, that's a much different question than asking are you for a candidate who supports the law that was passed, by the Congress?
Yep.
And when you say abortion rights, are you for abortion rights? I think you're gonna find people answering that question much differently than if you ask them specifically, do they consider themselves pro-life or pro-choice? So I just wanted you to respond to the methodology and how it affects the numbers that you found.
Sure. Well, the first thing to say is that we like the Pew Forum published the full questionnaire on our website. So the full question wording is out. It's certainly out there on the website for you to see. It's always the case. Any pollster will tell you that question wording always affects the results. The one thing we did have in our I'll find you the exact question wording in here in just a second so I can read it to you. But the question we had was about whether the candidate supported healthcare reform. We didn't spell it out that was passed by the administration this year, but we did say that supported healthcare reform.
You need the microphone? But I think that's my point. My point is that if you ask specifically about, his numbers are different than yours, I think,
Yeah.
because of that.
Right.
That's what I was trying to point out.
Thank you.
As I listen to both of the reports, it seems to point to a polarization in the future between Latino Catholics and white regularly attending Catholics. One of the things I wonder, though, is the issue of cohort. Did you break down cohort in terms of white regularly attending Catholics? And because I think, if that's the case, you might find eventually the younger white attending Catholics or white Catholics in general might mirror more Latino Catholics. Is there any stuff on cohort in your studies?
Well, we definitely ask people about their age in our surveys. What we don't have, though, are sufficiently large sample sizes that allow us to slice the data quite that finely. So, for instance, we typically find that a quarter or so of our samples are Catholic, 2/3 or 3/4 of them are white. Then you cut them not quite in half, but about 40% of them tell us that they go to church regularly. Now, once you're down to that group, we just don't have enough to be able to compare young versus old in many cases. However, I can certainly say that many of our data point in a similar direction as Robbie, particularly with respect to same-sex marriage, in that we find young people expressing more support for legalizing same-sex marriage. I can't say for certain if that's also true within the various religious groups, but if it were, it would certainly speak to what you described, that maybe this polarization, which I do think is an accurate way to describe the differences between white Catholics, especially regular attenders, and Latino Catholics, perhaps they will diminish.
So I'll take it. No, Greg's exactly right. And we have, and even with, I think both of our surveys are fairly large. Our sample size is 3,000, which is a pretty large sample size. But he's right. Once you slice it so many times, you can't do a lot. In 2008, we did do a large youth oversample with our American Values Survey in 2008. And one of the things that we found there is that these differences I was pointing to, particularly on gay and lesbian issues, run pretty clearly across all religious cohorts. So that younger Catholics, even younger evangelical Protestant Christians are much more likely than their older cohorts to support gay and lesbian rights. And the biggest difference is really there's a big break. There's less generational divide on individual rights for gay and lesbian Americans. So like things like non-discrimination in the workplace, don't ask, don't tell, those kinds of things that are about individuals. There's bigger generation divides on things that are about family structure and marriage. So things like adoption rights and marriage rights. That's where the bigger divides are.
Let me just point out one other thing that I think speaks to this question. We have picked up over the last couple of years on a similar trend by which there's been an uptick in support for gay marriage specifically, and we see that among many groups. But we also find that among white Catholics, and I think this is interesting, all of the increase in support for gay marriage among white Catholics has occurred among those who attend church less than once a week. So Catholics who say they attend church regularly look identical when it comes to gay marriage now as they did in 2008. 34% supported it then, 34% support it now. Among white Catholics who attend church less often, support for gay marriage has gone, let me just make sure I get this right, from 51% in 08 and 09 to 59% in 2010. So the change we're seeing on that issue is not occurring among religiously committed or the most high commitment Catholics. It's among the low commitment Catholics.
I wonder if I could follow up on that. One of the things that struck me as very interesting was the specificity of one of the questions that you reported regarding same-sex marriage, where you said specifically this would be a marriage at a justice of peace or a judge, and the numbers that you got there were strikingly different from the other ways you looked at the question. I think that is one of the most revealing aspects of polling and attitude collection and aggregation and disaggregation. And it strikes me that while I'm delighted that we're getting institutions doing very important research on religious cohorts and religious attitudes and segregating out a variety of denominations as your data point out. But I think that we're massively behind the curve about really relevant political data and the educational, civic educational function that polling can really produce. Because fundamentally, disaggregation is the real name of the game, and specificity is what really counts. And almost all of the findings that you produce, sad to say, simply generate macro kinds of information that on one hand reveal something interesting, but something that would be completely politically weird to say. Your findings show that Catholics are a proxy for the whole country. But it would be ridiculous to say political education would be advanced at all if we said, well, doesn't that mean that we are a Catholic country? And that's where aggregation and the sorts of sentences that you've come up with are valued and interesting. But I think that we've got to take some giant steps backward toward much more disaggregated and specific types of questions to get a handle on what it really means to find the religious factor playing a role in not only electoral politics, but policy politics. Because the only policy mentioned, the only policy question that is really specific was the one that you found stunningly different findings. A specific type of marriage at a particular place. So,
Well,
this
I mean,
is a pilot, and I hope it provokes some thinking.
Well,
some
I
action,
think
some
that these are
response.
some good points. I mean, I think you're certainly right to say that it would be a falsehood to say that the strong resemblance that Catholics bear to the country as a whole, it certainly would be false to say that that means that it's a Catholic country. What it means is that if you look at Catholics, which is, Catholics are a big group in the population, about a quarter of the population. They have many of the same demographic characteristics of the country as a whole. And so if you just look at all Catholics, they tend to very much look like the country as a whole. That's precisely why it's important to separate Latino Catholics from white Catholics, and observant Catholics from less observant Catholics. I mean, I think you're right, that in that respect, disaggregation is certainly vitally important. You're certainly very limited in the degree to which you can do it in surveys like these because of the limitations of sample sizes. If you have surveys that have hundreds of thousands of people in them, the groups that you can drill down to get very precise. You can make very fine-grained distinctions. If you do a survey of 1,000 or 2,000 or even 3,000 people, you're limited in terms of your ability to drill down to smaller and smaller components of the population. I mean, I think what we have to keep in mind is that what we have are different tools that are meant for, for different purposes. Surveys like these, I think it's fair to say, their very strength is the ability to aggregate. Their very strength is the ability to look at large groups of people and learn something about their characteristics, their motivations, their attitudes. The smaller the group that you're interested in, I think it's probably fair to say, the less appropriate that tool becomes. If you're interested in very, very particular kinds of people rather than in large groups, then I think you have to start thinking about either different kinds of polls or different kinds of methodologies altogether. So, I mean, on the one hand, I think you're certainly right to say that disaggregation is where much of the action is, where much of what we can learn is. At the same time, I also think it's important to keep in mind that these methodologies are very good for what they do, but they don't do everything. I mean, I think that's how I would respond.
Okay. Next question.
Yes, I'm Jane Fullerton. I'm with the newspaper based in Little Rock, the Arkansas Democrat Gazette. I'd just like to get you guys to maybe step back and be a little bit more general. If you talk about the, a reporter.
Now we start getting nervous.
You talked about the role of religion remaining important in politics in general, and then you've got some numbers that show some changes. So what I'm interested in asking is basically, would you say that role is changing, or would you say that it is impacting different issues or impacting those issues differently? Basically, the importance of religion this year and what's different about it.
Who wants to start?
Yeah, well, I'll jump in. A couple of things come to mind. One is actually some findings were released last week, and where we found, one of the places where there has been some of the most energy on the right side of politics, the conservative side of politics, has been among the Tea Party, those identified with the Tea Party. There's been a lot of press about that, a lot of energy, a lot of events. And one of the things that we were interested in looking at is what's the religious component of the Tea Party? Like what role is religion playing in all of that collective effervescence? If you'll allow me a Durkheim quote in the middle of the press conference. But what's the role that that religion is playing in that? And interestingly enough, we found that half of those who identify with the Tea Party movement also identified with the Christian conservative movement. So that tells you that there's some of that energy that has traditionally been there on the conservative side of politics that's been housed under the banner of the Christian conservative movement, that at least some of that energy has now been funneled into and is also funding the Tea Party movement, right? So that's one thing that comes to mind. The other interesting thing that this maybe sort of cuts the other direction that is worth noting is that in our survey, we found an increasing number of people, compared to 2006 and 2008, an increasing number of people who were more worried about public officials who are too close to religious leaders than public officials who don't pay enough attention to religion. So not a huge trend, but a slight uptick in people who are more worried about public officials too close to religious leaders. So some cautionary sense in the general public, I think, over the last few years about that sense as well. And I guess the third thing I would point to is where religion had been in 2004 so involved in politics, had been on these issues that now Greg so helpfully showed are at the bottom of the priority list, right? The so-called values voters issues of abortion, same-sex marriage. So I think two things to say is that they're down at the bottom of the list. And I think the data I point to is that they're not only down at the bottom of the list, but they're sort of drifting away from each other as a sort of coupled set of issues. And they're both in terms of support and in terms of salience, they're drifting a little bit apart from each other. And that's an important shift also. And then the last thing I would point to is immigration reform, where there's been a lot of religious energy this year of faith leaders across the board. From the evangelicals to the Catholic bishops, all the way to mainline Protestants on immigration reform, where religion has in many cases kept that drumbeat alive. When I think in Congress it was sort of waning and flagging, but I think their faith voices, if you're asking me to step back, have been a kind of integral part of that debate this year.
Can I just follow up on that quickly? Because when I talk to a lot of international visitors coming into Washington and discuss the intersection of religion and politics and its role in the elections and the Obama presidency, frequently the first question I get is about Obama's religious identity and why so many Americans don't believe the man when he says he's a Christian, and why it matters to so many Americans whether he is a Christian or a Muslim. Is that at all a part of the discussion going on in the campaign itself and having a role to play in political motivations for a number of these individuals you identified with the Tea Party and religious conservatives?
Yeah, you know, we didn't ask about that, but Greg has some numbers on that. So let me point to Greg.
It's teamwork up here.
Yeah.
Right. I don't know how much of an issue Obama's religion is in the midterm campaign. I don't know. I can't speak to the degree to which it might be, coming up in the House races. I think one of the things we have to keep in mind about congressional elections, and the data that certainly I've been discussing asks a very generic question in the election for Congress in your district, who would you vote for? It gets you one number, much like a presidential race, but we have to keep in mind that these are really 400 separate individual races. So I don't know how much it might matter in any one race. We do know, or from polling that we conducted this summer, that the number of people who think Obama is Muslim has grown over the last several years, from I think 11% in 2008 or so to 18%, I think is what we found this summer. And the number of people who think that he's Christian, or say he's Christian, has declined, I think, to about a third of the public now, with many people saying they don't know what Obama's religion is. And it's hard to say how much difference that can make in the elections. We certainly do know that views about Obama's religion are linked with views of Obama. People who think he's a Muslim have less favorable views of him. They're less, they approve less of his performance in office. I've had many people say to me, well, couldn't this just be then political opponents of Obama, trying to say something, that they don't think of as complimentary about him by saying that he's Muslim? There certainly could be something to that. What I think is even more interesting, though, in some ways, about our polling about how many people think Obama is a Muslim, is not how many people think he's a Muslim, but how many people, even among his supporters, say they don't know what he is. You've got lots of, so Democrats, for instance, haven't become more likely to say he's Muslim, but they have become less likely to say he's Christian, and more likely to say, I just don't know what his religion is. And we do know that when we ask people, is it important to you for the president to have strong religious beliefs? People overwhelmingly and consistently, time after time after time, tell us, yes, it is important to me. So we do know that these things matter. We do know that they are important to people, that they're linked to views about Obama. It's hard to say, precisely how much they might be linked with the 2010 midterm elections, but I certainly think it says something important about, the political climate, the political conditions out there.
Correct me if your data says it, but generally what we know is that more highly attending people tend to be older than younger. So that's sort of one thing to know, that the more frequently attending folks tend to be older. Our numbers show among white Catholics 40% attending weekly or more, roughly.
That's Catholic.
That's white Catholic, yeah, and slightly less than that among Latino Catholics. And I don't have the evangelical numbers right at hand, but you may have.
They're a lot
numbers.
higher, though.
Yeah.
White evangelicals are much more likely to say they go to church regularly.
Right. So that's a piece of it. What was the rest of it?
Right.
Yeah.
So you also saw that there was really no movement among the weekly attenders of Catholics.
Yeah, actually, I don't know. I'll have to
Okay.
check on that. We haven't actually run it
Okay.
and I'll have to see actually if our sample size will let us run it that small. But I'll check on it, because that would be. I actually made a note, because that'll be really interesting to see if the movement is really only among the more. Or only among the less frequently attending folks, but I can double check that in our data and get back to you. Yeah.
I'm Kim Lawton with the PBS show Religion and Ethics Newsweekly. A question about coalition building and religious groups. I understand there's no one Catholic vote or maybe one evangelical vote, but in the last election, the Obama campaign and the Democratic Party itself really reached out to faith groups in a very strategic way. And for the Democrats, groups that they hadn't necessarily reached out to. There's debate about how successful that was, but I'm wondering to what extent you're seeing movement among some of those swing Catholics or progressive evangelicals. Do we see any real political aligning, and is that continuing?
Well, we know that Obama picked up some of the younger evangelical crowd, right? We know that was one place where there were inroads made among evangelicals. I mean, our data, when we were comparing it to numbers at Obama, lagging behind Obama's numbers. So Obama had 26% support among white evangelicals, and our numbers are showing it again. And we've got, it's a little bit apples to oranges because we have a very similar question. It may actually be identical. I'll have to look at it, but it's about the Democratic or Republican candidate in your district, right? How are you going to vote? We aggregate that up. When we aggregate that up, it's 21%, so 5 points down, actually, from where Obama's levels were in 2008. So not a lot of, you wouldn't say from that huge inroads on that number. So lagging behind. Yeah.
I would just say along those same lines, and in response to the question, and this also gets, I think, to your question about sort of general patterns and how things may or may not be changing. And I'll also preface this by saying I want to defer to my colleague Scott Clement right there. Scott actually wrote for us back in August, I think it was, an analysis of the exit poll data from the 2008 election to see, okay, well, where's the change, where's the movement, what happened? And it's true that, that Obama, that the Democrats made inroads among pretty much everyone in 2008. Religious voters, they made gains across the board. It was a good year for Democrats. One of the things that has always struck me, though, as very interesting is that even with all of the discussion about, attempts by Democrats to gain support among religious voters, attempts to sort of narrow, quote unquote, the God gap, the difference between religious voters and people who say they're not religious or that they're unaffiliated. Even with all of that discussion, one of the interesting trends to me in recent elections, thinking back using particularly 2004 as a baseline, but even 2000 if you want to go that far, is that there's been no narrowing of the God gap whatsoever. The difference, for instance, between white evangelical voters on the one hand and voters who say they're unaffiliated with any particular religion has not narrowed at all. In fact, it may even have widened a little bit. You could even think in some ways of unaffiliated voters as just as important a part of the Democratic coalition as white evangelicals have become on the Republican side. All that said, one of the things that's interesting to me that we've seen in our data and that I saw hinted in your data as well is movement away from the Democrats among the unaffiliated. People who, when it comes to religion, say they're either atheist or agnostic, or that they're just nothing at all when it comes to religion. In the survey we conducted, in the surveys we've conducted this year, we found about a 7-point decline in Democratic partisanship among people who say they're unaffiliated. And I noticed on your slides that
11 points
you found,
down. Yeah.
Right. So one of the things that I think is interesting in terms of change that might happen, I don't know if it will or not, one of the things I'll be watching is what do unaffiliated voters do on election day? Do they swing back away from the Democrats a little bit, thus effectively with the potential of narrowing the God gap, but paradoxically to the detriment of Democrats? You know what I mean? It's this funny set of discussions combined with patterns in the data that I don't think have always lined up, and that's one of the things that I'll be keeping an eye on.
I just want to complicate the God gap thing a little bit here. Because one of the funny things is that it's never quite clear what we're talking about when we say the God gap, right? So I've seen articles written on it that talk about the gap between weekly or more attenders and everybody else. I've seen articles written about the numbers about whether a candidate or a party is perceived to be friendly to religion, that's the God gap. You've written on that as well. One interesting piece of this that I think is interesting that would point to a place where the Democrats did narrow and in fact close the God gap in 2008 was we actually took a page out of Pew's playbook, and they had been asking for some time about Americans' perceptions of the party's friendliness to religion, and we asked a question about perception of the candidates. Did they think John McCain was friendly to religion or not, or did you think Barack Obama was friendly to religion or not? And actually we found that on that question, Obama had actually closed the gap, that as many people said Obama was friendly to religion as McCain did. And Obama was significantly ahead of the Democratic Party, right? So many more people said Obama was friendly to religion than would say the Democratic Party is friendly to religion. So that was kind of an interesting moment, I think, in the '08 election, and it's sort of unclear, I think, where that is now, right? And it'd be hard to measure, right?
Yeah, because you don't have, right,
a candidate.
But then,
But-
let me thank you for
yeah.
pointing that out. I should actually not have used the term God gap. I think in our report, I think we used the term affiliation gap. And the differences that I'm describing, I should have been more precise in my language, are the differences between white evangelicals on the one hand, who really have become the core constituency, religious constituency of the Republicans, and unaffiliated voters, those who say they don't have any particular religion on the other hand. There certainly are other ways of looking at it, attendance gaps, party friendliness, other ways as well, but that's right.
Yeah. And the other thing to say, just one more point on this, is that the coalition building is much more complex on the Democratic side than it is on the Republican side. I mean, as you said, you've got a couple of core constituency groups, and then you've got a lot of ethnic minorities, you've got other religions, you've got you've got a much bigger and more complex basket on the Democratic side of politics to try to kind of appeal to and hold together if you're doing religious outreach. It's a much more complicated task on the Democratic side than on the Republican side.
Bill
I
D'Antonio.
want to return to the age cohort variable a bit. We've been conducting our studies of American Catholics since 1987, every 6 years. And one of the things we've done is break the population down into age cohorts. We call them pre-Vatican II Catholics, those born before 1940, Vatican II Catholics 41 to 60, and post-Vatican II Catholics 61 to 78. And in our last survey, we brought in the millennials. Among the things that we found that I think are important to think about, mass attendance rates has been consistent in all 4 studies within age cohorts. The pre-Vatican II Catholics have consistently reported a mass attendance rate weekly of 60%, up to 62, 63, 61. The Vatican II Catholics in the 40s, and the post-Vatican II Catholics in the 20s. The millennials, 15. When you ask about political party affiliation, the pre-Vatican II Catholics and the Gen X post-Vatican II Catholics are Republican. The Vatican II Catholics and the millennials were trending very strongly Democratic. I think it will be interesting, if you think about those 2 generations, we think of the Gen X or our post-Vatican II Catholics as the Reagan Catholics and the pre-Vatican II Catholics as having been also become Reagan Democrats and have maintained that. That it would be interesting to begin to look at the data across variables. I mean, we keep talking about Catholics go to Mass at a 40% rate. Well, not if you're talking about post-Vatican II Catholics or the millennials, and it's only been unfortunately, my generation is disappearing. And at some time or other, I said if the bishops would clone us, would stay, Protestants go. So I'd like to some comments on the importance of the age cohort variable.
Okay. Quickly, yes.
Well, I don't know if I can add much to that. I mean, I think there certainly will be no dispute from me about its importance. I don't know. I think particularly with respect to long-term trends in partisanship, we probably do have enough data to go back and look and see, look at the differences across generations there. But again, I think if we're talking about snapshots in time, I think our only limitation is one of sample size. But I certainly agree that it's, I think that it's certainly, it's yet another way, I think, that that points up the mistake that we can make if we just talk about a Catholic vote. You know, there are different Catholic votes. There are different Catholic generations. There are different races and ethnicities represented among. There's different ways of being Catholic represented among American Catholics, and these things all have impacts on, you know, politics, on other sociological variables. I agree. It's very important.
Okay.
I think it's a good opportunity for me to plug Greg Smith's book, Politics in the Parishes. So you can go to that as your one-stop shopping resource on this question and get all the information required. So we have time for one more question, is that correct?
Yes.
Please.
I'm sorry if somebody asked this before, but I have to go out for another interview. My name is Antonieta Cadiz. I work with La Opinion newspaper from Los Angeles. And if you have to make a projection, what would be the Catholic Latino vote behavior on the light of the new results that you presented here today? Do you think it will lean Democrat, Republican, this specific group?
For Latino Catholics, it'll unquestionably Democrat. Yeah, I mean, it's solidly Democrat. Yeah.
Florida?
In Florida too? He's
Oh,
asking.
I don't have state-specific data, but at the national level, we'll aggregate it again for you. But at the national level, it's sort of solidly Democrat. I mean, we had 7 in 10 Latino Catholics saying that again in early September of unregistered voters, we had 7 in 10, 72% of Latino Catholics saying they were going to vote for or lean toward voting for the Democratic candidate in their district.
Last question. In California, we have a campaign, actually the Republican Party had a campaign called Vota tus valores. It was called Vote for Your Values. And they will try to reinforce the fact that Latinos, we are Catholics, we are, anti-abortion, etc. Do you think that these kind of campaigns have a real effect on the vote at the end of the day, or is just something, anecdotal?
So quickly, I'd say, certainly an appeal to voting values has an appeal. I mean, I think everybody votes their values, right, when it comes right down to it. I don't know what else we're doing if we're not voting our values when we put something in the ballot, when we pull the lever. But if you mean by that a primary voting issue being abortion or same-sex marriage, I think, our data, Pew's data shows that those are not the animating issues for anyone really in this election cycle, and they don't show up on for Latino Catholics. And Latino Catholics actually on the issue of gay and lesbian issues, particularly in California, we actually did a survey in California in July, are actually quite supportive of gay and lesbian rights in California. So if that's the aim, I think it's going to should fall fairly flat if that's the aim. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I believe that closes our session. I want to express my gratitude to the Institute for Policy Research and Catholic Studies at the Catholic University of America here in Washington, D.C. for sponsoring this event, and its director, Professor Stephen Schneck. I thank you for putting together this panel and offering the opportunity to talk about a subject I believe is very, very important, the intersection of religion and politics. So I believe our bottom line is don't overlook the religion factor in politics this year, no matter how much you hear about the Tea Party from now until Election Day. Thank you for coming.